Welcome back to Politics on the Prairie. I'm your host, Dan Williams, or Spartan D34, depending on where you find me. And today, we'll be going over the results of Oklahoma State Question 820. Now, those of you who have seen my maps before may notice that this map looks quite different than the ones I make. That's because it isn't a map I made at all. This map was created by my good friend, Oklahoma Person on Twitter. So you can see here, he's got quite the comprehensive layout. The state question by county, congressional district, state house, state senate, with insets for a lot of the major cities in the state of Oklahoma, of course with a precinct map here. And today we'll be going over the results of it and using Oklahoma Person's wonderful map layout to go into some further detail about State Question 820. Now, this is part 1 of a multi-part series I'm going to be doing on the state question. We'll have to wait a bit to get the partisan turnout data, so we'll cover that a little bit later, and we'll focus on just results today. And also, since this map was provided to me by, again, the wonderful Oklahoma Person, I'll be making this episode free for everyone to view. So, of course, I recommend everyone follow at Oklahoma Person, Mapmaker on Twitter. And for those of you tuning into your first episode of Politics on the Prairie, I recommend you subscribe to the Patreon for more content like this. Anyway, enough intro, let's get into the results. So, for those of you unfamiliar, State Question 820 was about full recreational legalization of marijuana plus expungement of past offenses. And we'll go in here to the main precinct map to get an overview of the state at large. Now, this state question failed, as you can see here, around 21 points and some change. As you can also see here, there are only about 550,000 votes, 560,000 votes cast. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Oklahoma electorate, there are about 2 million people registered, so only about 25% turnout, which is pretty poor. Now, there's many reasons for this, but chief among them is that this election happened pretty much on a random Tuesday in March. And we can get more into that if you all want later, but let's get into the results for just right now. So, we've had a number of state questions in the state of Oklahoma since I've been following politics, and what I've noticed initially about this one is how polarized those results look. Now, what do I mean by that? Typically, you see in Oklahoma that state questions don't follow the normal partisan distribution in the state. If you see with Medicaid expansion, it does really well in areas that you would think it wouldn't. Recreational marijuana, for instance, did really well in areas you didn't think you wouldn't. What I mean by that is, mapping the traditional policy attitude onto the party. So, Democrats, at least some Democrats, are in favor of recreational marijuana. While we saw during the campaign, most Republicans in the state came out against it. So, I think with those Republicans coming out against it, we started to see more of a normal or nominal partisan distribution when it came to the state question. Blue areas, typically in the urban areas, voting yes for the state question, while red areas, and more rural, ex-urban, honestly, when it comes to Oklahoma, everywhere else voted against the state question. As you can see here, there are only really a couple blue dots, as they're usually called, on this map, with most of the areas being gold, corresponding with traditionally red areas. But let's take a look at the insets to get a better picture of this. So here we have our first inset, is the Tulsa metropolitan area, and as we can see, there are a lot of yes precincts in central Tulsa, southern Tulsa, getting out here into eastern Tulsa, over here in Osage County, which is, again, part of Tulsa City, not Tulsa County, though. A blue precinct out in Sand Springs, one out here, which is in between Sapulpa and Tulsa, a blue precinct out in Bixby, and then one towards Glenpool, and even a couple in Broken Arrow. Now, I don't think this maps entirely cleanly onto the partisan divide, or else we wouldn't see those blue precincts out in Bixby or Broken Arrow or in the Glenpool area. but still it follows it pretty closely with a higher density of blue precincts being in, of course, this Tulsa region here, Tulsa City, that is. Moving onward, we go down to the Oklahoma City Metro, and we can see that there are some blue precincts in rural areas, such as Lincoln County over here, but you still see a pretty normal or nominal partisan distribution with, of course, downtown Norman voting for it, Oklahoma City, downtown Oklahoma City, South Side, East Side, and parts of the Nazarene corridor. But you also see blue precincts out here in Yukon and Mustang, Shawnee and El Reno even, and more. Now, this is probably more to do to the depolarized nature of the um, ballot question, but you also, I think, see some ancestral voting. And what I mean by that is areas that vote have a voting history, being traditionally Republican and traditionally Democrats, are often referred to as ancestrally Democrat or ancestrally Republican, just like that. I don't actually know who coined the phrase, but it's something that's been tossed around groups like Election Twitter and has made it into the modern political lexicon as of recent. One interesting thing, or a couple of interesting things I'd like to note here, is that far east Norman, around Lake Thunderbird, seems to have voted for it, and yet this kind of near east Norman area and the western area of Norman voted against it. Now, I think there's some turnout mechanics at play that flip these precincts into the yes column. But another interesting thing I'd like to point out here is that we have bits of more voting for it. In one of my next videos, where I cover the shift between the 2018 and 2022 gubernatorial races, we'll get into a little bit more about how Moore is changing as a community. But that's from another video, not this one. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is that something I've talked about a lot online, but I don't think I've mentioned yet in videos, is this area around here, around Lake Hefner, has gone back to voting at least historically Republican or ancestrally Republican, with a lot of precincts that have been trending towards Democrats reverting back to voting against against the state question or the traditional Republican position. In my opinion, the state question overperformed in Edmond, whereas the blue precincts or Democratic precincts are generally limited to around UCO and around this Broadway corridor. You see lighter shades of, for lack of a better term, red, even though I know it's gold, across the whole city of Edmond. However, talking about the opposite direction, a lot of the historically black East Side was had margins you wouldn't expect. Again, I think this has to do with turnout. I'll highlight this as we look at the state house margins real quick here. If we take a look at State House District 97, for instance, we can see that there's really low turnout, even lower turnout than most other state house districts, with only about 4,600 voters, where you see, here you have 5,700 voters, over here you have 6,000. So with that lower turnout, you may have seen traditionally the lower turnout populations, like black populations, not turn out in this election since it was such a random time. And that might explain some of the lower margins than you would traditionally expect here in the historically black east side part of Oklahoma City. Moving on, we'll go to Stillwater real quick here. As you can see, Stillwater is limited in the yes vote just down to really the campus areas, with most of the other regions of Stillwater voting against the measure. And then you have Langston. Langston's pretty far down from its usual blue shade. Again, this is probably coupled with lower turnout due to the randomness of the election and a little bit of depolarization. Moving to L-Town, or Lawton as some people call it, I guess correctly, we see that we have a couple of light blue yes precincts in central Lawton, but predominantly everywhere else, West Lawton, East Lawton, voted against it pretty hard. And knowing the Lawton area like I do, I know there's many more voters in these areas over here than there are in Central Lawton. Central Lawton is more commercial, whereas the residential zones of the city have been pushed to the eastern and western edges at this point. Oh, and Duncan has a blue yes precinct, so good for them. Good for Duncan. And just a full disclosure, I'm sure you can tell I voted yes on the measure. I'm not sure how that pertains to my analysis, but just it might, I guess take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. Here we move to Bartlesville, or Beeville as I like to call it. We can see it has two light blue yes precincts. Now, Bartlesville as a community is traditionally Republican, and that's kind of an understatement. So it's interesting to see that there are some yes precincts in this very Republican town north of Tulsa. Here we go down to Muskogee. Now, if any of you are Merle Haggard fans, I believe that's correct, you may have heard of the song Okie from Muskogee, where they don't smoke marijuana. However, in the 2018 recreational election, 2018 medicinal marijuana election, Muskogee voted overwhelmingly for the state question. As we can see here, that did not carry to the recreational election, sticking with only a couple of blue precincts in downtown Muskogee and having the city of Taft vote for it while the rest of the area votes against the measure. Moving to Ardmore, we see our usual split with Ardmore, with the traditionally Democratic precinct voting for the measure and the rest of the area, which is pretty Republican, voting against the measure. And our final inset here is of Enid, or Enid America, as some people say. And as we can see here, there are two precincts in Enid that voted for the measure. Right here, this is downtown Enid, where there's a larger Hispanic population compared to the rest of the town, and actually a large Marshallese, or people that hail from the U.S. Marshall Islands, population in this area. So, a bit following the Democratic trends there, though I would like to remind everybody that Enid is is far and away a very Republican town, so even having any precincts vote for it is a great deviation from the town's normal partisan makeup. So, overall, we can see that around the state question did well in normally Democratic precincts while failing in traditionally Republican precincts, with certainly a few exceptions. I think just a little editorialization, I suppose. I don't know if I quite use that term correctly, but one of the things I think of what went wrong for State Question 820 was most of the budget, from what I understand, was spent on ads. In my opinion, my humble opinion as a political analyst and a data person, ads don't really work in Oklahoma. We saw a similar thing happen in the gubernatorial election where we saw upwards of $30 or $40 million spent on ads. The thing about ads is that you can turn a TV off, you can turn a radio off, you can switch videos on YouTube, or scroll past them on social media. I don't really think they're persuaders or turnout getters. I really think that in order to overcome the randomness of this election, the low turnout of this election, and hard persuadability of some of these voters, you would have had to have a large coordinated field campaign. And I think that's the common error we seem to be making on the Democratic side of things right now, is that we're not investing enough in field, we're not knocking enough doors, contacting enough voters that way. I'm not saying you can't have ads, I'm not saying you can't reach out to people through mailers or anything like that, but, face-to-face contact is probably the most beneficial, and the more cycles we don't invest in this, the more cycles we're going to see an entire statewide map of counties voting against our interests. Anyway, sorry to end on such a bummer note there, or maybe a high note, depending if you're a person that wanted this state question to fail. But like I said at the beginning of the video, we'll be covering the partisan turnout this election to really dig into what happened on the demographic level. So be on the lookout for that. Again, this map was made by Oklahoma person. He is an excellent map maker, as you can see, with great tables and great layouts. He's posted this on his Twitter. I'd highly recommend go check it out at Oklahoma person on Twitter and give him a follow. Like and retweet his maps. He's really good. He's really just pinnacle of map makers out there, especially for political stuff in Oklahoma, and I can't recommend him enough. And he's a good friend of mine and a great guy. So thank you for tuning in to this episode on politics on the prairie. We'll see you in the next video. Have a good evening.